The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard as Annabeth Carter stood beside her father's weathered wagon, her tall frame drawing disapproving glances from the neighbors who'd gathered to witness her departure. At 6 feet in her bare feet, she towered over most men in their small Missouri town, a fact that had sealed her fate as surely as any crime might have. $20, her father muttered, counting the bills one more time. That's all they'd give for her. Said she was too tall, too strong-looking, not what men want in a wife. Her mother stood silent, arms crossed, refusing to meet Annie's eyes. The shame of having an unmarriageable daughter had worn on them for years, and now they'd found their solution, selling her to a mail-order bride agency that specialized in difficult cases. Annie kept her chin high, though her heart felt like lead in her chest. She'd known this day would come. At 23, she was well past the age most girls married, and her height had scared off every potential suitor her parents had paraded before her. The final straw had been last month's harvest dance, when even the widow Johnson's son himself, no prize at 40 with a limp and 3 children, had laughed at the suggestion of courting her. "Get on, then," the agency man barked, jerking his thumb toward the covered wagon where 5 other women already huddled. "We've got ground to cover." She climbed aboard without looking back, squeezing her long legs into the cramped space. The other women shifted away from her, whispering behind their hands. She recognized the pattern. It was the same wherever she went. Too tall, too broad-shouldered, hands too large and rough from working alongside her brothers in the fields. The wagon lurched forward, beginning the long journey west. Mile after dusty mile rolled by, and with each one, the whispers grew bolder. "Lord above, look at the size of her," a petite blonde named Sally muttered. "What man would want that in his bed? Maybe they'll use her for plowing instead," another giggled, earning sharp laughter from the rest. Annie pressed herself into the corner, making herself as small as possible, a futile effort. When they stopped for the night, she was made to sleep outside the circle of campfire warmth, told there wasn't enough room under the wagon's shelter for someone of her size. The agency man, Mr. Crowley, seemed to take particular pleasure in her discomfort. "You're lucky we took you at all," he said, tossing her a portion of hardtack that was smaller than what the others received. "Most men want a woman they can protect, not one who looks like she could wrestle a bull." Days blended into nights, and nights into days. At river crossings, Annie was made to wade through the water to test the depth while the others rowed. When the wagon got stuck in mud, she was the one commanded to push while the oxen pulled. Her dress tore on brambles. Her boots wore thin, and still they traveled on. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in the New Mexico territory, Thatcher Holt stood on the porch of his ranch house, reading the letter for the 3rd time. His foreman, Jake, waited patiently nearby. "Says here they've got a woman nobody else wants," Thatcher said, his voice rough from disuse. "Coming cheap, just needs a place to land." "You thinking on it?" Jake asked carefully. He'd worked for Thatcher since before Martha died, had seen the man fold in on himself these past 2 years like a house with its center beam removed. Thatcher folded the letter, tucking it into his vest pocket. "Martha made me promise," he said quietly, "before the fever took her. Made me swear I wouldn't live out here alone forever. That ain't the same as taking on some stranger, boss." "No," Thatcher agreed. "But I need help around here, someone who can work. This letter says she's sturdy, used to labor. That's more useful than pretty out here." Jake nodded slowly. He understood. The Holt Ranch sat in hard country, pressed up against the Sangre de Cristo Mountains where the wind could strip paint off wood and the sun baked the earth to concrete in summer. It wasn't a place for delicate flowers. "When's she coming?" "Letter says the wagon should reach Silver Creek in 2 weeks. I'll ride out to meet it." Neither man spoke of love or companionship. This was business, plain and simple. Thatcher needed another pair of hands, and somewhere out there was a woman desperate enough to take whatever offer came her way. The wagon rolled into Silver Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, dust-caked and travel-worn. Annie climbed down last, her legs shaky from the confinement. The other women had already been claimed by their intended husbands, whisked away to their new lives with varying degrees of enthusiasm. She stood alone beside the wagon, her few possessions in a cloth bundle at her feet. "Mr.?" Crowley consulted his ledger. Frowning, "Holt," he called out. "Thatcher Holt here?" A man separated from the shadows of the general store's porch. Annie's first thought was that he looked like he'd been carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him, weathered, solid, unmovable. He wasn't tall by her standards, perhaps 5'10", but he carried himself like someone who'd never needed height to command respect. "That's me," he said, approaching with measured steps. His eyes, gray as winter sky, took in Annie's full height without flinching. This her? Such as she is. Crowley sneered. "Like I wrote, she's no beauty, but she's strong. Should be able to handle whatever work you've got." Thatcher's jaw tightened at the man's tone, but he said nothing. Instead, he looked directly at Annie for the first time. "What's your name?" "Annabeth Carter," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Annie? Can you work?" "Yes, sir." "Cook?" "Passably." "Handle livestock?" "I've worked with horses and cattle since I was young." He nodded once, then turned to Crowley. "She'll do." The transaction was completed with insulting efficiency. Money changed hands. Annie tried not to think about how little, and papers were signed. Within minutes, she found herself sitting beside Thatcher Holt on the bench of his wagon, leaving Silver Creek behind. They rode in silence for the first hour. Annie studied the landscape, so different from Missouri's green hills. Here, the earth was red and brown, dotted with sage and juniper, rising toward mountains that looked like they could tear the sky. "It's not an easy life," Thatcher said suddenly, his voice cutting through the wagon's creaking. "The ranch is remote. Nearest neighbor is 10 miles off. Town's a day's ride. Winters are hard. Summer's harder." "I'm not looking for easy," Annie replied. He glanced at her then, something almost like surprise in his expression. "House needs work. You'll have your own room, small, but private. Meals together, but—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "This isn't about romance. I need help. You need a place. We understand each other?" "Yes, Mr. Holt. Thatcher," he corrected. "We'll be working side by side. Might as well use given names." The ranch appeared just as the sun was setting, painting the humble collection of buildings in shades of gold and crimson. A main house of adobe and timber, a barn that had seen better days, corrals that needed mending, and endless miles of scrub range stretching toward the mountains. Thatcher helped her down from the wagon, the first person in weeks to offer her that simple courtesy. His hands were calloused and strong, but his touch was careful, as if he wasn't sure how to handle her. "I'll show you your room," he said, lifting her bundle before she could protest. "Supper's usually at sundown. Tonight might be late." The house was spare but clean, bearing the signs of a woman's touch long faded. Curtains gone sun-pale, a rocking chair by the cold fireplace, dried flowers in a vase that hadn't been changed in seasons. Annie's room was indeed small, barely large enough for the narrow bed and washstand. But it had a window facing the mountains and a door she could close. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. After weeks of cruel exposure, the privacy felt like luxury. Thatcher paused in the doorway, seeming to want to say something more. Finally, he just nodded. "Welcome to the Holt Ranch, Annie." As his footsteps faded down the hall, Annie sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself one moment of complete stillness. She'd been sold for $20, transported like livestock, and deposited in a strange man's house in the middle of nowhere. By all rights, she should feel worthless. Instead, for the first time in years, she felt something else entirely: possibility. The first morning at the Holt Ranch came with a rooster's crow and the distant howl of coyotes. Annie dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, her fingers fumbling with buttons as she tried to shake off the strange dreams that had plagued her sleep dreams of endless horizons and a gray-eyed man who spoke in careful, measured words. She found Thatcher already in the kitchen, coffee brewing on the stove. He looked up when she entered, a flicker of surprise crossing his weathered features. "Didn't expect you up so early," he said, pouring a second cup without asking if she wanted one. "I'm used to early rising." Annie accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm tin mug. "What needs doing first?" He studied her over the rim of his own cup. "Can you milk?" "Yes. Bessie's in the barn. Temperamental thing. Kicks if you approach her wrong. After that, eggs from the hen house. I'll be mending fence in the north pasture." It was more words than he'd strung together since picking her up yesterday. Annie nodded and headed for the door, pausing when he called after her. "There's work gloves hanging in the barn. Might be a bit small for you, but better than nothing." The kindness, small as it was, caught her off guard. She murmured her thanks and stepped out into the cool morning air. Bessie proved to be a brown cow with a disposition as sour as week-old milk. She rolled her eyes at Annie's approach, stamping her hooves in warning. But Annie had dealt with worse. Her father's bull had been twice as mean and 3 times as dangerous. She approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones her grandmother had taught her. "Now then, girl, we're going to be friends. You and I. No point in fighting about it." To her surprise, Bessie settled after only a few minutes of protest. The milk came steadily, filling the pail with warm, foamy white. Annie was just finishing when she heard voices approaching the barn. "I'm telling you, Holt's lost his mind," a man was saying. "Taking in some woman nobody else wanted. Might as well hang a sign saying he's desperate." "Maybe he is," another voice replied. "Been 2 years since Martha passed. Man gets lonely. Lonely's one thing, foolish is another. You hear what they're saying in town? She's near tall as a man, built like one too. Probably can't even cook a decent meal." Annie's hand stilled on the pail. She recognized the voices now, neighboring ranchers who'd come to borrow tools or trade livestock. Through a gap in the barn wall, she could see them standing with Thatcher near the corral. "That's enough." Thatcher's voice cut through their gossip like a blade. "You came for the shoeing iron. Take it and go. Now." "Thatcher, we didn't mean—" "I said enough." There was steel in his tone that made Annie shiver. "What goes on at my ranch is my business. The lady is here to work, same as any hand I might hire. You got a problem with that? You can shoe your own horses from now on." The men muttered apologies and retreated hastily. Annie waited until their horses' hoofbeats faded before emerging from the barn. Pail in hand, Thatcher was still standing by the corral, his posture rigid. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, not sure why she was apologizing, but feeling the need nonetheless. He turned sharply, as if he'd forgotten she might be nearby. "You heard that?" "Yes." His jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. "They're fools. Pay them no mind." "I'm used to it," Annie said, then wished she hadn't. It sounded too much like self-pity. Thatcher's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her want to fidget. Then he simply nodded toward the house. "Breakfast needs making. Bacon's in the cold house, flour in the pantry." The days fell into a rhythm after that. Annie rose before dawn, tended the animals, cooked meals, mended what needed mending. The work was hard but familiar, and she found satisfaction in the way the ranch began to show small improvements under her care. The hen house, cleaned and reorganized, yielded more eggs. The garden patch, neglected for who knew how long, began to show green shoots after she cleared the weeds and hauled water from the well. Thatcher worked from sunup to sundown, speaking little but watching everything. Sometimes Annie would catch him looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not the disgust or mockery she was used to, but something more complex, as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. The first real test came 2 weeks after her arrival. Annie was hanging laundry when she heard the thunder of hooves and the panicked bellowing of cattle. A dust cloud rose from the south pasture, and through it she could see the herd scattering in all directions, spooked by something. Without thinking, she dropped the wet shirt she'd been holding and ran for the corral where her mare, a steady paint Thatcher had assigned her, stood dozing. She threw on the bridle and swung up bareback, her skirts hiking up scandalously as she urged the horse toward the chaos. The problem became clear as she drew closer. A mountain cat, lean and desperate, had tried to take a calf and missed, sending the herd into blind panic. Cattle were heading for the ravine, where broken legs and worse waited. Annie had helped with stampedes before, though never alone. She pressed her heels into the mare's sides, racing to get ahead of the lead steer. The ground was rough, full of rabbit holes and rocks that could send horse and rider tumbling, but she didn't slow. She cut across the herd's path, waving her arms and shouting, trying to turn them away from disaster. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought she'd failed. The cattle bore down on her, a wall of horns and muscle and mindless fear. Then the led steer veered, followed by another and another, until the whole herd was turning in a wide arc back towards safer ground. She was just allowing herself a breath of relief when she saw Thatcher riding hard from the other direction, rifle in hand, his face a mask of grim determination. Their eyes met across the settling dust, and she saw something flash through his expression. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper. That night at supper, he broke their usual silence. "Where did you learn to ride like that?" "My father raised horses," Annie said, concentrating on cutting her beef into precise pieces. "Before he decided farming paid better, I was in the saddle before I could properly walk. You saved half the herd today. That ravine would have broken them." She looked up, startled by what sounded almost like praise. "I did what needed doing." "Yes," he said quietly. "You did." They ate in silence for a few minutes before he spoke again. "The mountain cat won't give up easy. They get desperate this time of year with game scarce. I'll need to track it, make sure it doesn't come back." "I can help," Annie offered without thinking, then immediately regretted it. What did she know about hunting mountain cats? But Thatcher didn't laugh or dismiss her. Instead, he considered her thoughtfully. "Can you shoot?" "Passably. Better with a rifle than a pistol." "There's a Winchester in the barn. Needs cleaning, but it shoots true. You can carry it when you're working far from the house." He paused, then added, "Just in case." It was the closest thing to concern he'd shown for her well-being, and it warmed her more than it should have. The sandstorm struck 3 days later. Annie had seen the signs, the uneasy behavior of the animals, the strange yellow tinge to the western sky, but she'd underestimated how quickly it would descend. She was checking on a sick calf in the far barn when the wind began to howl, carrying with it a wall of sand that turned day to twilight in seconds. She managed to get the barn door closed, but the sand found every crack and crevice, filling the air with grit that stung her eyes and coated her throat. The calf bleated in terror, and she gathered it close, trying to offer comfort she didn't feel. Time lost meaning in the roar of the storm. She couldn't see beyond her outstretched hand, could barely breathe through the cloth she'd wrapped around her face. The barn shook under the wind's assault, and she wondered if the roof would hold. Then, through the chaos, she heard her name being called, Thatcher's voice, hoarse with sand and worry. Coming closer. "Here," she shouted, though the wind tore the word away. "I'm here." The barn door burst open, and he stumbled in, immediately forcing it shut again. In the dim light filtering through the cracks, she could see he was coated in dust, his eyes red-rimmed with worry. "Damn fool, woman," he said, but there was relief in his voice. "What were you thinking? Coming out here with a storm brewing? The calf needed tending." She replied, still holding the animal. "I didn't think—" "No, you didn't." He moved closer, and she realized he was checking her for injuries, his hands surprisingly gentle as they touched her arms, her face. "Are you hurt?" "No, just—" She gestured helplessly at the storm raging outside. "Trapped!" He nodded, then did something unexpected. He shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, over her own thin shawl. It was warm from his body heat and smelled of leather and sage and something uniquely him. "Could be hours before this passes," he said, settling down in the straw near her. "Might as well get comfortable." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind. The calf had calmed, falling asleep in Annie's lap. Without thinking, she shifted closer to Thatcher, seeking human warmth and comfort in the face of nature's fury. He didn't pull away. Instead, after a moment's hesitation, he put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. It was the first time they'd touched beyond the necessary, and Annie felt something shift between them in that barn, surrounded by sand and wind and the strange intimacy of shared shelter. "My wife," he said suddenly, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Martha, she was small, delicate. I used to worry every storm would blow her away." He paused, and Annie felt him look down at her. "You're different." She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or just an observation, but something in his tone made her heart beat faster. "Different how?" "You don't need protecting," he said simply. "You just handle things." They didn't speak again until the storm finally passed, leaving them to emerge blinking into the late afternoon sun. The ranch was covered in a fine layer of sand, but nothing was seriously damaged. As they walked back to the house, Annie tried to return his coat, but he shook his head. "Keep it for now. You're still shivering." That night, she lay in her narrow bed wearing his coat like armor, wondering what it meant that a man who'd hired her for work was starting to see her as something more than just another pair of hands. She was bandaging a cut on her palm a week later, trying to repair a section of barbed wire fence, when Thatcher appeared in the kitchen doorway. He took in the bloody cloth and her awkward attempts to wrap the bandage one-handed, and crossed the room without a word. "Let me," he said, taking her hand in his. His touch was careful, methodical, but Annie found herself holding her breath as he cleaned the wound and applied fresh bandaging. This close, she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines carved by sun and sorrow around his eyes. "You should be more careful," he murmured, still focused on her hand. "It's just a scratch." He looked up then, and their faces were suddenly very close. "Is it?" For a long moment, they stayed frozen like that, her hand cradled in both of his, their eyes locked. Annie felt something electric pass between them, a possibility as vast and dangerous as the desert itself. Then Thatcher stepped back, releasing her hand as if it burned him. I'll finish the fence," he said roughly, and fled the kitchen like a man pursued. Annie stood there, cradling her bandaged hand to her chest, and wondered if she was beginning to want something she had no right to hope for, not just a place to belong, but someone to belong with. Outside, another storm was building on the horizon, but this one had nothing to do with weather. The dream started 3 nights after the sandstorm. Thatcher would wake in the cold hours before dawn, sheets damp with sweat, Martha's face fading from his mind's eye like morning mist. But it wasn't her voice calling his name anymore. It was Annie's, strong and steady, pulling him back from whatever dark place his sleeping mind had wandered. He took to rising even earlier, fleeing the house before Annie could emerge from her room. He'd find reasons to work the farthest corners of the ranch, returning only when exhaustion demanded it. If she noticed his avoidance, she gave no sign, continuing her work with the same quiet efficiency that had marked her first days. It was guilt, he told himself as he mended fence posts in the brutal afternoon sun. Guilt that Martha's ghost was fading, that another woman's presence was filling spaces he'd sworn would stay empty. His wife had been dead 2 years, but he'd made promises. To her, to himself, to God. What kind of man was he if comfort came so easily in the form of a tall woman with steady hands and eyes that saw too much? The uneasy dance might have continued indefinitely, if not for the arrival of Josiah Crowley on a Tuesday afternoon. Annie was in the garden, coaxing life from the stubborn soil, when she heard the approaching horses. Her blood ran cold at the familiar voice carrying across the yard. "Holt! Thatcher Holt! I've got business with you!" She straightened slowly, dirt-caked hands gripping the hoe like a weapon. Through the garden fence, she could see Crowley dismounting, accompanied by 2 rough-looking men she didn't recognize. Thatcher emerged from the barn, rifle casual in his hands, not pointed at anyone, but present. State your business and be quick about it, Thatcher said. Crowley's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Seems there was a problem with our transaction. The girl there, he pointed at Annie, wasn't paid in full. Contract says she owes another $40 for transport and fees. I paid what you asked. Thatcher's voice was dangerously quiet. You paid the base price, but there are additional costs, food, lodging, protection on the journey. It's all here in the contract. Crowley produced a paper with a flourish. She can pay up, or she comes back with us. Got another buyer interested. Fellow up in Colorado who doesn't mind them big and sturdy. Annie felt the blood drain from her face. She'd heard stories about the men who bought women multiple times, selling them from place to place like livestock. Each situation worse than the last. Her hands started to shake. Let me see that contract, Thatcher said, setting down his rifle to take the paper. His eyes scanned it quickly, jaw tightening with each line. This is robbery. It's business, Crowley corrected. $40 by week's end. Or we take her back. Your choice. Holt. What happened next occurred so fast, Annie barely had time to process it. Thatcher's fist connected with Crowley's jaw with a crack that echoed across the yard. The man went down hard, blood spurting from his nose. His companions reached for their guns, but found themselves looking down the barrel of Thatcher's rifle. He'd snatched it up with lightning speed. Get off my land, Thatcher said, his voice deadly calm. And if you come back, if you so much as look at anyone on this ranch again, I'll bury you where you stand. That woman is not property to be sold and resold at your whim. She's under my protection now. You understand me? Crowley struggled to his feet, holding his bleeding nose. You'll regret this. Holt, I've got the law on my side. The law? Thatcher laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean Sheriff Morrison in Silver Creek? My old regiment buddy? By all means, go cry to him about your illegal contracts and flesh trading. See how far that gets you. The three men retreated, Crowley shooting venomous looks over his shoulder as they rode away. Thatcher stood watching until they disappeared over the ridge, tension radiating from every line of his body. Annie approached slowly, the hoe still clutched in her hands. Thatcher, he turned to her, and she was shocked to see his hands shaking. Did they hurt you? On the journey here, did they? No, she said quickly, understanding what he was asking. They were cruel, but not in that way. He nodded, some of the wildness leaving his eyes. Good. That's good. He seemed to realize he was still holding the rifle and set it aside carefully. I should have read that contract more carefully. Should have known a man like that would try something. It's not your fault, Annie said. You couldn't have known. It is my fault, he interrupted harshly. I brought you here. I'm responsible for... He stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Just go inside. Annie, please. But she didn't move. Instead, she stepped closer. Close enough to see the rapid pulse in his throat, the way his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. Why did you do that? You could have paid them? $40 is... Because you're not for sale, he said fiercely. Not for $40, not for $400. You're a person, not property, and I'll be damned if I let anyone treat you otherwise. The vehemence in his voice broke something open in Annie's chest. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm. He froze at the contact, looking down at her hand as if he'd never seen one before. Thank you, she whispered. They stood like that for a long moment, the afternoon sun beating down on them, the echo of violence still hanging in the air. Then Thatcher gently pulled away. There'll be trouble now, he said, voice rough. Crowley won't let this go. You should. You should think about whether you want to stay. I could find you somewhere else, somewhere safer. No. The word came out sharper than she intended. No, I'm not running. This is my home now. Something flickered in his eyes at the word home. Annie, I'm not leaving. Thatcher, not unless you want me to. He looked at her for a long time, this woman who stood tall and unafraid in his dusty garden, dirt under her nails and steel in her spine. I don't want you to go, he admitted quietly. God help me, I don't. That night, dinner was a silent affair, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Annie cleared the dishes while Thatcher stoked the fire, the domestic routine a comfort after the day's violence. She was heading to her room when he called her back. "Annie, wait!" She turned to find him standing by the fireplace. Silhouetted against the flames, he looked younger in the soft light, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen him. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about Martha, about why I've been keeping my distance." Annie moved closer, settling into the chair across from his. "You don't have to." "I do." He stared into the fire as he spoke. "She was 17 when we married. I was 25. Thought I knew everything about the world. She was so small, so delicate. I spent our whole marriage trying to protect her, to keep her safe from everything, the wind, the sun, the hard work of ranch life." His hands gripped the arms of his chair. "But I couldn't protect her from the fever. When it took her, I thought I'd failed, that if I'd been more careful, done more." "It wasn't your fault," Annie said softly. He looked at her then, eyes bright with old pain. "I know that. In my head, I know. But when I see you here, doing all the things I never let her do, facing dangers I would have shielded her from, it feels like betrayal, like I'm admitting she could have been stronger if I'd let her." Annie absorbed this, understanding dawning. "And now you're trying not to make the same mistake with me." "Am I?" His laugh was bitter. "Sometimes I think I'm making whole new mistakes. You don't need my protection. Annie, you proved that today. Probably would have handled Crowley just fine on your own. But I wanted to protect you anyway. Not because you're weak, but because—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish. Annie leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Because why?" Instead of answering, he stood abruptly. "It's late. You should rest." But as he passed her chair, Annie caught his hand. The touch froze them both, that same electric current from the kitchen sparking between them. His hand was warm, calloused, and after a moment, his fingers curled around hers. "Thatcher," she breathed, not sure what she was asking. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her face, and something in his expression broke, slowly, as if moving through water. He knelt beside her chair, bringing their faces level. His free hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing across her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "Because you matter," he whispered. "God help me, Annie, you matter." For a heartbeat, she thought he would kiss her. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Then voices carried from outside, riders approaching fast, and the spell shattered. Thatcher was on his feet in an instant, reaching for his rifle. "Stay inside." But Annie was already moving, grabbing the Winchester he'd given her from beside the door. "Like hell." He shot her a look that was part exasperation, part something warmer, then eased the door open. 3 riders were indeed approaching, but as they drew closer, Annie recognized Jake, Thatcher's foreman, along with 2 other ranch hands. "Boss," Jake called out, dismounting quickly. "We got trouble. That mountain cat you were worried about, it took down one of Morrison's prize horses. He's organizing a hunting party, wants you to join, says with your tracking skills." Thatcher lowered his rifle. "When?" "First light. He's gathering every good shot in the valley. Tell him I'll be there." Thatcher glanced back at Annie. "And tell him I'll be bringing someone." Jake followed his gaze, taking in Annie's tall form with the rifle comfortable in her hands. A slow grin spread across his weathered face. "Yes, sir. I'll tell him." After the men left, Thatcher turned to Annie. "You don't have to come. It'll be dangerous." "I'm coming," she said firmly. "We're partners, aren't we? I protect what's mine, too." The word mine hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility. Thatcher nodded slowly. "Partners." They stood on the porch, watching the riders disappear into the darkness. Without the crisis to focus on, the awareness of what had almost happened by the fireplace returned tenfold. Annie could still feel the phantom touch of his hand on her cheek, the promise in his eyes before duty called him away. "We should rest," Thatcher said finally. "Early start tomorrow." "Yes," Annie agreed, but neither moved. "Annie," he said softly, and she turned to find him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "After tomorrow, after we deal with this cat, we need to talk about us, about what's happening here." "I know," she whispered. He reached out, fingers ghosting along her arm before falling away. "Good night, Annie. Good night, Thatcher." She watched him disappear into the house, then stood alone on the porch for a long moment, looking up at the stars. Tomorrow would bring danger in the form of claws and fangs. But tonight had brought a different kind of danger, the possibility of a heart that had been closed for 2 years finally beginning to open again. Inside the house, she heard Thatcher moving about, preparing for bed. Soon, she would go to her own small room, lie in her narrow bed, and try not to think about strong hands gentle on her skin, gray eyes dark with wanting, the promise of after tomorrow hanging in the air like smoke. But for now, she stood in the darkness and allowed herself to hope. The storm arrived without warning just after noon, catching them in the middle of replacing damaged roof slats on the equipment shed. Annie saw it coming first, a wall of black clouds racing across the desert like wild horses, lightning flickering in its depths. "Thatcher," she called down from her perch on the roof. "We need to get inside?" He looked up from sorting lumber, following her gaze to the approaching tempest. His face went grim. "No time. Help me get the tools under cover." They worked frantically, gathering hammers and saws, coiling ropes, securing anything the wind might turn into a projectile. The first fat raindrops were falling as they ran for the house, but they'd barely made it halfway when the sky opened up entirely. Within seconds, they were soaked through. The rain was cold, driven by wind that cut through wet clothing like knives. Annie could barely see through the downpour, but she felt Thatcher's hand catch hers, pulling her not toward the main house but to the smaller kitchen building that sat closer. They burst through the door just as hail began mixing with the rain, ice balls the size of marbles drumming against the roof. Thatcher slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing hard. Water streamed from his hair, his clothes plastered to his body. Annie stood in the middle of the small space, arms wrapped around herself, shivering violently. Her dress clung to every line of her body, leaving nothing to imagination, and she was acutely aware of how she must look, hair hanging in wet ropes, tall frame outlined in soaked fabric. "There are towels in the pantry," Thatcher said, his voice rougher than usual. He moved past her carefully, as if trying not to touch her, and returned with an armful of clean cloth. "Here." Their fingers brushed as she took a towel, and despite the cold, heat sparked between them. Annie ducked her head, focusing on wringing water from her hair, but she could feel his eyes on her. "You're shivering," he observed. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." He grabbed another towel and, after a moment's hesitation, stepped behind her. "Your hair's soaked through. Let me." His hands were gentle as he worked the towel through her long hair, squeezing out the worst of the water. Annie stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. No man had touched her hair since she was a child, and the intimacy of it made her knees weak. "Better?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. She turned to answer and found him much closer than expected. They stood there, bodies separated by mere inches, wet clothes steaming in the warm kitchen air. His eyes dropped to her lips, and Annie felt her own gaze drawn to his mouth. "Annie," he said, her name a question and a prayer. "I should change," she whispered, but made no move to leave. "Yes," he agreed, not moving either. "You should." The air between them crackled with tension thicker than the lightning outside. Annie could see the struggle in his face, duty warring with desire, the ghost of his past fighting the possibility of his future. Then thunder crashed directly overhead, shaking the building, and they moved simultaneously. not away from each other, but together, his arms coming around her as she pressed against his chest. For a moment, they just held each other, two people seeking comfort from the storm. But comfort transformed into something else as his hands splayed across her back, as her fingers curled into his wet shirt. She lifted her face to his, and this time there was no hesitation. His mouth came down on hers with 2 years of loneliness and longing behind it. The kiss was nothing like Annie had imagined her first kiss would be. It was desperate and consuming, tasting of rain and need. Thatcher's hands tangled in her wet hair, angling her head to deepen the contact, and she heard herself make a sound she'd never made before, part gasp, part plea. He walked her backward until her spine hit the wall, never breaking the kiss. She had to tilt her head down slightly. He was shorter than her, but in this moment it didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the heat of his mouth, the solid weight of him pressing against her, the way her body responded to his touch like drought-broken earth drinking in rain. His lips moved to her throat, and Annie's head fell back against the wall. "Thatcher," she breathed, fingers clutching at his shoulders. He pulled back suddenly, breathing ragged, eyes dark with want. "Tell me to stop," he said roughly. "Annie, if you don't want this, I want this," she interrupted, surprised by her own boldness. "I want you." Something shifted in his expression, the last wall crumbling. This time when he kissed her, it was slower, deeper, a claiming and a promise all at once. His hands framed her face, thumbs stroking her cheekbones as he explored her mouth with thorough dedication. Annie had spent her whole life being told she was too much, too tall, too strong, too bold for a woman. But in Thatcher's arms, she felt exactly right. He held her like she was precious but not fragile, desired but not diminished. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling. The storm still raged outside, but inside the kitchen, another kind of storm had passed through, leaving everything changed in its wake. "We should get back to the house," Thatcher said, though he made no move to release her. "You need dry clothes." "Yes," Annie agreed, equally reluctant to move. They stood there for another long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. Then, with visible effort, Thatcher stepped back. He grabbed a large oilcloth from a hook by the door. "We'll share this." "Run fast and stay close." They dashed through the rain together, huddled under the inadequate shelter of the cloth. By the time they reached the main house, they were laughing at the futility of it, soaked anew but somehow lighter for it. Inside, they stood dripping in the entrance, suddenly awkward again. The passion of moments before seemed impossible in the familiar surroundings, with doors to separate rooms waiting. "You should change," Thatcher said again, and this time Annie nodded. "Yes," but before she could move toward her room, he caught her hand. "Annie, what happened in there?" "Did you regret it?" she asked, bracing for disappointment. "No." The answer came quick and firm. "No, I want to do right by you. You deserve more than stolen moments in a storm." Annie turned his hand over in hers, studying the calluses and scars of a life hard lived. "What if stolen moments are enough for now?" He squeezed her fingers gently. "They're not for you." "Not anymore." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Change clothes. I'll make coffee. We'll figure this out." She left him there, water pooling around his boots, and went to her small room. As she peeled off her soaked dress and reached for dry clothing, her lips still tingled from his kiss. Her skin still burned where he'd touched her. When she emerged, dressed in her one other work dress, hair braided back wet, she found him by the fire. He'd changed too, and built the flames up high against the chill. 2 cups of coffee waited on the small table between the chairs. They sat in their accustomed places, but everything felt different now. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility, of words waiting to be spoken. "I loved my wife," Thatcher said finally, staring into the fire. "Want you to know that what I felt for Martha was real." "I know," Annie said softly, "but she's gone." He looked at her then, eyes reflecting the firelight. "And you're here, and what I feel for you, it's not the same, but it's not less. It's different. Stronger in some ways. Does that make sense?" Annie thought of all the men who'd looked past her, through her, seeing only her height and strong build as flaws to be overlooked or endured. Then she thought of how Thatcher looked at her, really saw her, and found her worthy of protection, of partnership, of desire. "Yes," she said. "It makes sense." He set down his coffee and moved to kneel beside her chair, as he had the night before when Crowley had come. But this time there was no interruption looming. "I'm not an easy man, Annie. I've got ghosts and rough edges and a temper that runs too hot. This ranch is hard living, and it'll only get harder. But if you'll have me—" "Yes," she said before he could finish. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his weathered features. "You don't even know what I was going to say." "Doesn't matter." She cupped his face in her hands, marveling at the rasp of stubble against her palms. "Whatever it is, yes." He turned his head to kiss her palm, then rose, drawing her up with him. This time when they came together, it was with tenderness rather than desperation. He had to stretch up slightly to kiss her, and she bent down to meet him, and somehow that small accommodation felt like a metaphor for everything they were building together. "My room or yours?" he asked against her lips, and Annie felt heat flood through her at the implications. "Yours," she decided. Her narrow bed would never fit them both comfortably. He led her by the hand down the hall to the room she'd never entered, the one that had belonged to him and Martha. She hesitated at the threshold, wondering if ghosts lingered here. "I changed everything after," he said, understanding her pause. "Couldn't bear to keep it the same. It's just my room now." And it was, sparse and masculine, with a bed large enough for his frame, a simple dresser, and a window facing the mountains. The storm had passed while they talked, leaving the late afternoon sun to slant golden through the glass. They came together slowly, with careful hands and patient mouths, learning the shape of each other in the honeyed light. When he helped her with the buttons of her dress, his fingers trembled slightly, and Annie found that endearing beyond words. "You're beautiful," he said when she stood before him in only her shift, and the reverence in his voice made her believe it. So beautiful. Annie. She'd been called many things in her life. Too tall, too plain, too much like a man, but never beautiful. Not until this moment, with this man looking at her like she was everything he'd never known he needed. Later, as they lay entwined in his bed, Annie traced patterns on his chest while he played with her unbound hair. The intimacy of it still stunned her, that she could touch him like this, that he wanted her to. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I never expected this," she admitted. "When I climbed into that wagon back in Missouri, I thought I was heading toward a life of loneliness and labor. I never imagined—" "What?" he prompted when she trailed off. "Love," she finished quietly. "I never imagined love." His arms tightened around her. "Is that what this is?" She rose up on an elbow to look at him. "Isn't it?" Instead of answering with words, he pulled her down for a kiss that was answer enough. When they broke apart, both were breathless again. "Stay," he said. "Not just tonight, not just as help. Stay as my wife, proper married, in the church in town, with papers and rings and everything, right?" "Thatcher Holt," she said, a smile blooming across her face. "Are you proposing to me?" "I am." He sat up, bringing her with him, holding her hands in his. "I know it's fast. I know people will talk, but I also know what I feel when I look at you. When I hold you, I know I want to wake up beside you for whatever years God grants us. Will you marry me?" "Annie." She thought of the life she'd left behind, where no one had wanted her. She thought of Crowley and his contracts, of being sold for pennies because she was too tall. Then she thought of this man who'd fought for her, who saw her height as strength, who held her like she was precious. "Yes," she said, laughing through sudden tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her again, and they fell back into the bed, the sunset painting their skin gold and rose. Outside, The desert was washing clean from the storm, puddles reflecting the clearing sky. But inside the house that would truly be Annie's home now, two wounded hearts were finally, fully healing. The woman who rode into the ranch yard 3 weeks after the storm was everything Annie wasn't. Petite, delicate, dressed in traveling clothes that had somehow remained pristine despite the dusty journey from town. She sat side-saddle on a hired mount, a picture of feminine grace that made Annie acutely aware of her own work-worn hands and practical dress. "Clara," Thatcher said, his voice carefully neutral as he helped her dismount. "This is unexpected." Clara Whitfield smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Thatcher. I hope you don't mind my coming unannounced. There are matters we need to discuss." Her gaze slid to Annie, taking in her height and sturdy frame with a single dismissive glance. "You must be the new... help." "This is Annie Carter," Thatcher said firmly. "My fiancée." Something flickered across Clara's face. Surprise, perhaps, or disgust. "Fiancé? How sudden?" Annie felt Thatcher tense beside her, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Whitfield. Would you like to come inside? I'll make coffee." "That would be lovely," Clara said, though her tone suggested it would be anything but in the house. Clara perched on the edge of a chair like a bird ready to take flight, her traveling case at her feet. She looked around the room with proprietorial interest, noting changes since her last visit. "You've let the curtains fade," she observed. "Martha made those herself. Spent weeks on the embroidery. Sun's hard on fabric out here," Annie replied evenly, setting down the coffee service. She'd learned Martha had been Clara's older sister, taken by fever 2 years past. It couldn't be easy, seeing another woman in her sister's home. Indeed. Clara took a delicate sip of coffee. "I suppose someone like you wouldn't understand the importance of maintaining a proper home." "Clara," Thatcher warned. "Oh, I meant no offense," Clara said with false sweetness. "I'm sure Miss Carter, was it? I'm sure she does her best. It must be quite an adjustment, going from..." She gestured vaguely at Annie. "Whatever her circumstances were to mistress of a ranch." Annie felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "Every adjustment has its challenges." Clara set down her cup with a decisive clink. "Well, let's discuss why I've really come. Thatcher, I have papers here from Father's lawyer. As you know, when Martha married you, part of her dowry included the water rights to Willow Creek, which runs through your northern boundary." Thatcher's face darkened. "Those rights were Martha's, and she left them to me. Actually," Clara produced a document from her case, "they were held in trust, reverting to the family if Martha died without children. Father was willing to let it go while you mourned, but now that you're remarrying, he feels it's time to settle the matter." Annie watched Thatcher's hands clench into fists. Willow Creek was vital to the ranch's survival, especially during drought years. Without it, half the grazing land would be worthless. "Your father gave his word," Thatcher said through gritted teeth. "Verbally, perhaps, but legal documents supersede verbal agreements, don't they?" Clara's smile was sharp as glass. "Of course, Father might be persuaded to extend the current arrangement, given the right circumstances." "What circumstances?" Annie asked, though she suspected she already knew. Clara turned to her with mock surprise. "Oh, you're still here. I thought perhaps you'd excuse yourself. This is family business. After all..." "Annie is family," Thatcher said firmly. "Whatever you have to say, you say in front of her." "Very well." Clara smoothed her skirts, a gesture somehow both delicate and threatening. "Father is concerned about the ranch's future. Thatcher, you're not getting younger, and if you're to remarry and potentially have children, we need assurances that the Whitfield interests will be protected." "Get to the point," Thatcher growled. "The point is that Father questions your judgment. First Martha's death, which perhaps could have been prevented with proper care, and now this unusual choice of bride." She looked Annie up and down again. "A woman of her stature. Can one really expect her to be a proper wife? To run a household, raise children, represent the ranch in society? Annie stood abruptly, unable to sit still under the assault. She moved to the window, staring out at the land she'd come to love, trying to control her breathing. "That's enough," Thatcher said, rising as well. "Annie is 10 times the woman." "The woman Martha was?" Clara finished, eyebrows raised. "Do go on. Thatcher, tell me how this Amazon you found is so superior to my sister." "I didn't say that." "You were about to—" Clara stood as well, all pretense of civility dropping away. "Martha loved you. She left her family, her comfortable life, everything she knew to come to this God-forsaken wilderness with you. And for what? To die of fever while you were off playing rancher?" "Clara," Thatcher's voice was dangerous now, "you need to leave. Not until we settle this." She pulled out more papers. "Sign the water rights back to the family. It's what Martha would have wanted, to keep them with blood relations, not with whatever woman you dragged in to warm your bed." The crude implication made Annie turn from the window. "Miss Whitfield, I understand you're grieving your sister. You understand nothing." Clara snapped. "You're nothing but a mail-order embarrassment, too mannish for any decent man to want. The only reason Thatcher took you in was desperation and loneliness. Do you really think he looks at you and doesn't see everything Martha wasn't? Tall where she was petite, rough where she was refined, common where she was quality." Each word landed like a physical blow, hitting every insecurity Annie had ever harbored. She saw Thatcher move toward her and held up a hand to stop him. This was her battle to fight. "You're right," Annie said quietly, and both Thatcher and Clara looked surprised. "I am tall. I am rough. I came here because no one else wanted me. Sold cheap because I didn't fit what people think a woman should be." She stepped closer to Clara, using her height advantage for once. "But I also saved this ranch's herd from stampeding into a ravine. I've mended fences and birthed calves and faced down men who thought they could buy and sell me like cattle. I've made this land profitable again with work and sweat and determination." She paused, looking down at the smaller woman. "I may not be delicate or refined, but I love that man with everything I have. And more importantly, he loves me, not despite what I am, but because of it. Can you say the same about any man in your life?" "Miss Whitfield?" Clara's face flushed deep red. "How dare you—" "No," Annie interrupted. "How dare you come into my home and try to shame me for not being your sister? Martha is gone, and I'm sorry for your loss, but I won't apologize for being alive, for being here, for being loved." "Your home?" Clara laughed bitterly. "This will never be your home. You'll never be anything more than a substitute, a poor replacement for what Thatcher really wanted. Get out." Thatcher's voice cut through the room like a whip. "Now." Clara gathered her papers with shaking hands. "You'll regret this. Father will take those water rights, and your precious ranch will dry up like everything else you touch. You couldn't save Martha, and you won't save this place either." She swept toward the door, pausing for one last shot. "Enjoy playing house while you can, Miss Carter. When reality sets in, when Thatcher realizes what he settled for, you'll find yourself back where you belong, unwanted and alone." The door slammed behind her, leaving deafening silence in her wake. Annie stood frozen by the window, Clara's words echoing in her mind. When Thatcher reached for her, she pulled away. "Annie, I need some air." She fled out the back door, not running but walking fast, needing distance from the poison Clara had spilled in their home. She found herself at the small grove of cottonwoods near the creek, the one soft spot in the harsh landscape. Sinking down against a tree trunk, she finally let the tears come. Not many. She'd learned early that crying solved nothing, but enough to release the pressure in her chest. That's where Thatcher found her an hour later, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, making herself as small as her frame would allow. He sat beside her without speaking, close but not touching. They watched the water flow by, clear and precious, the very thing that might be taken from them. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Clara had no right. She had every right. Annie interrupted. She's protecting her sister's memory, her family's interests. I understand that. Understanding it doesn't make it acceptable. He shifted to face her. Annie, look at me. She did, reluctantly, afraid of what she might see in his eyes now that Clara had voiced all the comparisons he must make every day. Do you remember what I told you that night by the fire? That what I feel for you is different from what I felt for Martha? Annie nodded. Clara thinks that's a bad thing. She thinks different means less. But she's wrong. He reached out, carefully taking her hand. I loved Martha, but I spent our whole marriage trying to make her into something she wasn't, strong enough for this life. And she spent it trying to be what I needed, until the effort of it wore her down to nothing. His thumb traced circles on her palm. With you, I don't have to pretend the life out here is easier than it is. I don't have to protect you from it because you face it head on. You don't try to be delicate or fragile because that's not who you are. And I love who you are. Annie, not as a substitute, not as second best, but as yourself. Even if it costs you the water rights? Annie asked. Even if fighting for me means losing half your ranch? Even then. He lifted her hand to his lips. The ranch is just land. It can be rebuilt, moved, started over. But you, there's only one Annie Carter in this world, and I was lucky enough to find her. She studied his face, searching for any doubt, any regret. Finding none, she finally let herself lean into him, resting her head on his shoulder despite the awkward angle required by their height difference. Clara was right about one thing, she murmured. I'm not a proper lady. I never will be. Thank God for that, Thatcher said fervently. Proper ladies are highly overrated. Despite everything, Annie found herself smiling. That's not what most men think. I'm not most men. He turned to press a kiss to her temple. And you're not most women. Maybe that's why we fit. They sat in comfortable silence until the sun began to sink low. Finally, Thatcher stood, pulling her up with him. Come on, let's go home. What about Clara, the water rights? I'll wire my lawyer in Santa Fe tomorrow. If the Whitfields want to fight, they'll get one. But tonight, he wrapped an arm around her waist. Tonight, I just want to have dinner with my future wife and not think about anything beyond these borders. As they walked back to the house, Annie felt some of Clara's poison beginning to drain away. The woman's words had cut deep, touching every fear Annie carried about not being enough. But Thatcher's steady presence beside her, the simple acceptance in his touch, was a stronger antidote than any pretty words could be. That night, as they prepared for bed in what was now their shared room, Annie caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The same tall frame, the same strong features, the same work-roughened hands. Nothing had changed in her appearance, but when Thatcher came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder, she saw something different in the reflection. Not beauty in any conventional sense, but something better. A woman who belonged, who was chosen, who was loved not despite her differences but because of them. What are you thinking? He asked, meeting her eyes in the mirror. That Clara was wrong, Annie said softly. This is my home. You are my home, and no amount of legal documents or family fury can change that. He turned her in his arms, kissing her with a thoroughness that left no room for doubt. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. We'll face whatever comes, he promised. Together. Together, she agreed, and for the first time since Clara's arrival, truly believed it. The first snow came early that year, dancing down from a pewter sky in thick, lazy flakes that quickly blanketed the ranch in white. Annie stood at the kitchen window, watching the familiar landscape transform into something alien and beautiful. She'd seen snow in Missouri, but here in the high desert, it felt different, more isolating, more threatening. Storm's going to be a bad one, Thatcher said from behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Jake's bringing the cattle down from the high pasture. We'll need to check the feed stores, make sure we have enough to last if we get snowed in. Annie leaned back against him, drawing comfort from his solid warmth. They'd been married 2 months now. A simple ceremony in town with Jake and his wife as witnesses. Clara's threats about the water rights still loomed. But for now, they'd carved out a small piece of happiness. "I'll help with the cattle," she said, already moving toward her coat. "No." His arms tightened around her. "Annie, you've been tired lately, pale. Let Jake and me handle it." She wanted to protest, but he was right. The past week had brought a bone-deep exhaustion she couldn't shake, along with dizzy spells that came from nowhere. Just yesterday, she'd had to sit down suddenly while feeding the chickens, the world tilting sideways without warning. "I'm fine," she said anyway, because that's what she always said. He turned her to face him, studying her with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "When's the last time you ate a proper meal? You barely touched dinner last night, or breakfast this morning." Annie opened her mouth to deflect, then closed it. The truth was, the smell of food had been turning her stomach lately, even coffee, which she'd always loved, now made her queasy. "Maybe I'm coming down with something," she admitted. Concern creased his brow. "We should get Doc Morrison out here." "No." The word came out sharper than intended. "No, it's just a cold. I'll rest today. I promise." He didn't look convinced, but before he could argue further, Jake's shout from outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see him riding hard toward the house, his horse kicking up clouds of snow. Thatcher grabbed his coat and was out the door before Jake even dismounted. Annie followed despite his earlier admonishment, pulling her shawl tight against the wind. "Boss, we got trouble," Jake said, breathing hard. "Found tracks up by Willow Creek. Wolf pack, looks like. Big one. And..." He hesitated, glancing at Annie. "There's blood. Pretty sure they got one of the calves." Thatcher cursed under his breath. Wolves were bad enough in good weather, but with a storm coming, desperate predators could decimate their herd. How many? Hard to say. At least 6. Maybe more. They're bold too. Tracks came right up to the fence line. "Get Sam and Rodriguez. We'll need to move the herd closer to the barn. Post watches through the night." Thatcher was already moving toward the house for his rifle. "Annie, I need you to..." But Annie wasn't listening. The world had suddenly tilted again, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. She heard Thatcher call her name, felt strong arms catch her as her knees buckled, then nothing but soft, encompassing darkness. She woke to find herself in bed, Doc Morrison's weathered face hovering above her. The elderly physician was checking her pulse, his expression thoughtful. "Well now, Mrs. Holt, back with us. I see." "What happened?" Her voice came out as a croak. "You fainted," Thatcher said from beside her. She turned to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, one hand clasping hers tightly. "Scared 10 years off my life. Woman." "I'm sorry, She tried to sit up, but Doc Morrison gently pushed her back down. "Easy now. You need to rest." He packed his instruments back in his bag with practiced efficiency. "When did you last have your monthly courses, Mrs. Holt?" Annie felt heat flood her cheeks. What does that have to do with anything?" The doctor's eyes twinkled with knowing humor. "Humor an old man? When?" She thought back, calculating. With everything that had happened, the wedding, Clara's visit, the constant work of the ranch, she hadn't paid attention to her body's rhythms. 2 months ago, maybe longer. And the fatigue, the dizziness, not keeping food down? Annie's eyes widened as understanding dawned. She looked at Thatcher, whose face had gone curiously blank. "Doc," he said slowly, "are you saying..." "I'm saying congratulations are in order." Doc Morrison snapped his bag shut with satisfaction. "Unless I miss my guess, you'll be parents come spring." The room fell silent except for the wind howling outside. Annie pressed a trembling hand to her still flat stomach, trying to process this impossible news. She'd resigned herself long ago to childlessness. What man would want children with a woman like her? Even after marrying Thatcher, she'd assumed her body, like everything else about her, was too different, too wrong for something as natural as motherhood. "Annie?" Thatcher's voice was careful, uncertain. "Say something." She met his eyes, seeing her own shock reflected there. "I never thought. Everyone always said I was that my body wasn't made for—" "Well, everyone was wrong," Doc Morrison said briskly. "You're healthy as a horse, Mrs. Holt. Tall women have babies same as short ones. Now, you'll need to take care, eat when you can, rest when you need to. No heavy lifting. This storm looks to be a bad one, so I'll leave some remedies for the nausea." He looked pointedly at Thatcher. "And you'll need to make sure she actually rests. No more working herself to exhaustion." After the doctor left, fighting through increasing wind to make it back to town before the roads became impassable, Annie and Thatcher sat in stunned silence. The bedroom felt smaller somehow, as if this new knowledge took up physical space between them. "Are you—" Thatcher cleared his throat, started again. "How do you feel about this?" Annie considered the question honestly. "Terrified," she admitted. "Happy? Confused? Worried?" She looked down at their joined hands. "What if Clara was right? What if I don't know how to be a proper mother? I've never been delicate or maternal or—" "Stop." He moved closer, tilting her chin up to meet his eyes. "You saved a calf from drowning last month. You've nursed sick chickens back to health. You sing to the horses when you think no one's listening. How is that not maternal? That's different." "No, it's not." His hand moved to rest gently on her stomach, wonder creeping into his expression. "Our child, God, our child, will be the luckiest in the territory. You know why?" Annie shook her head, tears threatening. "Because their mother is the strongest, bravest, most capable woman I know. You'll teach them to ride and shoot and stand tall no matter what the world says, and I'll—" He paused, vulnerability flickering across his features. "I'll try to do better than I did before, be more present, less afraid." "You're thinking of Martha," Annie said softly. "She lost 2 babies before the fever took her," he admitted. "Doc said it was because she was too delicate, too fragile for the harsh life out here. I blamed myself, thought if I'd kept her somewhere civilized." He shook his head. "But you're not her. You're strong enough for this life, for this child. I believe that." Outside, the storm intensified. Snow driving against the windows with increasing fury. They could hear the cattle lowing in distress, the men shouting as they worked to secure the herd. But inside their room, a different kind of intensity held them still. "I need to help with the cattle," Thatcher said finally, though he made no move to leave. "And I need to check the stores. Make sure we have enough food if we're snowed in for weeks," Annie added, equally motionless. They looked at each other, then burst out laughing. Nervous, slightly hysterical laughter that broke the tension. "We're having a baby," Annie said wonderingly. "We're having a baby," Thatcher confirmed, grinning like a fool. The next weeks tested them all. The storm raged for 3 days, piling snow to the windows, trapping them inside while the wind howled like the wolves Jake had spotted. They lost 2 calves to the cold and 1 to predators, the men taking shifts through the brutal nights to guard the herd. Annie chafed at being confined to the house, but her body gave her little choice. The nausea came in waves, leaving her weak and shaking. Some days she could barely keep water down, let alone food. Thatcher hovered, bringing her tea and toast, reading to her from the few books they owned when she was too tired to leave bed. "You'll wear a groove in the floor with all your pacing," she told him one evening as he walked the bedroom for the 10th time. "I can't help it." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I should be able to fix this, make you feel better. Do something." "You are doing something," Annie assured him. "You're here. That's enough." But she could see the fear in his eyes, the memory of another woman growing weak in this same bed. Another pregnancy that ended in sorrow. She wished she could promise him everything would be fine, but her own body felt foreign to her now, changing in ways that left her off balance both literally and figuratively. The storm finally broke just before Christmas. leaving behind a world transformed by white. The men dug paths between buildings, checked on neighbors, counted their losses and blessings in equal measure. Annie managed to leave bed, moving carefully through days that felt fragile as spun glass. It was Jake's wife, Mary, who finally brought real comfort, a practical woman who'd birthed 5 children on various frontier homesteads. She took one look at Annie's pale face and shooed Thatcher out of his own kitchen. "Men," she said dismissively, settling Annie in a chair by the fire. "They mean well, but they're useless with breeding women. Now, let's talk plain about what's happening and what's to come." For the first time since Doc Morrison's announcement, Annie found herself able to voice her real fears. Not just about the pregnancy, but about motherhood itself. What if the child inherited her awkward height? What if she didn't know how to be soft and nurturing the way mothers were supposed to be? "Supposed to be?" Mary snorted. "According to who? You think frontier children need mothers who simper and faint? They need mothers who can shoot straight, work hard, and love fierce. That's you, Annie Holt, whether you see it or not." She shared practical wisdom too, remedies for the sickness, exercises to prepare for birth, ways to adapt clothing as her body changed. By the time she left, Annie felt more settled, more capable of facing what lay ahead. That night, as she and Thatcher lay in bed listening to coyotes call across the snow, she felt the first flutter of movement in her belly, soft as butterfly wings, barely there, but unmistakably real. "Thatcher," she breathed, grabbing his hand and pressing it to her stomach. "Feel." He waited, patient and still, until it came again, that tiny, miraculous stirring of life. His sharp intake of breath told her he'd felt it too. "Our baby," he whispered, wonder and terror mingling in his voice. "Our baby," she confirmed, covering his hand with hers. Outside, winter held the land in its frozen grip. Wolves still threatened the herd. Clara's legal challenge still loomed, and the future remained uncertain as always in this harsh country. But inside, wrapped in warmth and love and the miracle of new life quickening between them, Annie felt rich beyond measure. She thought of that day months ago when she'd been sold for $20, deemed worthless by every standard she'd been taught to value. Now she lay in the arms of a man who treasured her, carrying a child who would know from birth that strength came in many forms, that worth couldn't be measured in coins or conventional beauty. "What are you thinking?" Thatcher asked, his hand still resting protectively over their child. "That I'm grateful," she said simply. "For you, for this life, for everything that brought me here, even the hard parts." He kissed her temple, her cheek, her lips, soft, reverent touches that said more than words could. "I love you, Annie Holt. You and this little one both." "Even if it's a girl who grows tall as her mother?" she asked, half teasing, half afraid. "Especially then," he said firmly. "This world could use more women who stand tall." Annie smiled in the darkness, feeling the baby move again, feeling her heart expand to make room for this new love growing inside her. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. It always did out here. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged. Home, loved, and carrying the future beneath her heart. The winter wind sang against the windows, and Annie let it lull her toward sleep, one hand on her belly, the other clasped in Thatcher's. In spring, when the snow melted and the desert bloomed, their child would be born into a world that didn't always welcome those who were different, but they would be born loved, wanted and valued, worth more than all the gold in California to the parents who waited to meet them. And that, Annie thought as sleep finally claimed her, was wealth beyond measure. The courthouse in Silver Creek had seen better days. Paint peeled from its walls, and the February wind whistled through gaps in the window frames. But the courtroom itself maintained a certain dignity, with its high bench and witness stand worn smooth by years of frontier justice. Annie sat beside Thatcher on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded over the gentle swell of her belly. At 6 months pregnant, she could no longer hide her condition, though she'd worn her most modest dress in hopes of appearing respectable. Around them, the courtroom buzzed with curious townspeople who'd come to witness the water rights dispute that had been brewing all winter. Clara Whitfield sat across the aisle with her father and their lawyer from Santa Fe, her posture rigid with righteous indignation. She hadn't looked at Annie once since entering the courtroom, focusing instead on arranging and rearranging her papers. All rise for the Honorable Judge William Thornton. The bailiff called out. Judge Thornton was a bear of a man with shrewd eyes and a reputation for fairness. He settled himself behind the bench and surveyed the courtroom with the air of someone who'd seen every kind of human drama play out before him. We're here in the matter of Whitfield versus Holt, regarding the water rights to Willow Creek, he began. Mr. Pemberton, you represent the Whitfield family. The Santa Fe lawyer rose smoothly. I do, Your Honor. We intend to prove that the water rights in question were part of a trust that reverts to the Whitfield family upon the death of Martha Whitfield Holt, who died without issue. Mr. Crawford? The judge turned to Thatcher's lawyer, a younger man from town who specialized in land disputes. Your Honor, we will demonstrate that Martha Holt left all her earthly possessions to her husband, including any water rights, and that the alleged trust document is invalid. Very well, Mr. Pemberton. Call your first witness. The morning proceeded with mind-numbing legal arguments about property law and inheritance statutes. Annie struggled to follow the complex language, her back aching from the uncomfortable bench. Beside her, Thatcher sat stone-faced, his jaw tight with controlled anger. Then Clara took the stand. Miss Whitfield, Pemberton began. Tell us about your sister's marriage to the defendant. Clara's voice rang clear and poisonous through the courtroom. Martha was 17 when she married Mr. Holt, barely more than a child. She left everything she knew to follow him to this wilderness, trusting him to care for her. And did he? He isolated her on that ranch, miles from civilization. She had no friends, no social life, no proper medical care. When she fell ill, Clara's voice caught dramatically. He was out working cattle. She died alone while he was playing rancher. Annie felt Thatcher flinch beside her. She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly under the fold of her skirt. And now he's taken up with... Clara's gaze finally landed on Annie, cold and dismissive. Another woman, someone wholly unsuitable to be mistress of property that rightfully belongs to the Whitfield family. Objection, Crawford called out. The witness is speculating about suitability. Sustained. Judge Thornton ruled. Stick to facts, Miss Whitfield. But the damage was done. Annie could feel the weight of the town's judgment in their stares, taking in her height, her work-worn hands, her obvious pregnancy. Not the delicate flower they'd expect for a rancher's wife. The afternoon brought Josiah Whitfield himself to the stand, Martha's father. He was a prosperous merchant from Albuquerque, silver-haired and distinguished, everything a respectable citizen should be. My daughter's dowry included those water rights, he testified. They were meant to provide for her and her children. Since she died childless, they should return to the family. Mr. Whitfield. Crawford rose for cross-examination. Isn't it true that you verbally agreed to let Mr. Holt retain the water rights after your daughter's death? Whitfield shifted uncomfortably. I may have said something to that effect in my grief, but verbal agreements don't supersede legal documents. I see. And isn't it also true that you made no move to reclaim these rights until Mr. Holt announced his engagement? I don't see how that's relevant. It's entirely relevant, Crawford pressed. You were content to let the matter lie until Mr. Holt chose to remarry. This isn't about legal rights, is it? It's about punishing him for moving on with his life. Objection. Pemberton rose. Counsel is badgering the witness. Overruled. Judge Thornton said mildly. Answer the question, Mr. Whitfield. I simply wish to protect my family's interests. Whitfield said stiffly. If Mr. Holt chooses to ally himself with someone of questionable background and reputation. Objection. Now Crawford was on his feet. There's been no evidence presented about Mrs. Holt's background or reputation. Sustained. The judge's gaze was sharp. The jury will disregard that comment. But again, the words hung in the air like smoke. Annie kept her chin high, though she wanted nothing more than to flee the courtroom and its suffocating judgment. Then came the surprise witness. The defense calls Samuel Morrison to the stand. Annie straightened in surprise as Doc Morrison made his way forward. She hadn't known he would testify. "Dr. Morrison," Crawford began after he was sworn in. "You attended Martha Holt during her final illness?" "I did. Can you tell the court about that?" The old doctor sighed heavily. "Martha Holt suffered from recurring fevers for months before the one that took her. I advised Mr. Holt multiple times that she needed to winter in a warmer climate, maybe return to Albuquerque for proper care. And did he follow this advice?" "He tried, but Martha refused to leave, said the ranch was her home, and she'd rather die there than live anywhere else." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Clara's face flushed red. "You were also present the night she died?" "I was. Mr. Holt rode through a blizzard to fetch me, nearly killed his horse and himself getting to town. He was there at the end, holding her hand." "So he didn't abandon her to work cattle, as has been suggested?" "Absolutely not." Doc Morrison's voice was firm. "I've seen many husbands in my years of practice. Thatcher Holt loved his wife deeply, cared for her devotedly, and blamed himself for her death far more than anyone else ever could." "Thank you. One more question. Doctor, you also attend Mr. Holt's current wife?" "I do. And in your professional opinion, is she a suitable mistress for a ranch?" Doc Morrison actually smiled. "Annie Holt is one of the strongest, most capable women I've had the privilege to treat. She's brought that ranch back to prosperity through hard work and good sense. And," his eyes twinkled, "she'll give him fine, healthy children, if the one she's carrying is any indication." "Objection!" Pemberton was practically purple. "The witness's opinions about breeding are hardly relevant." "Withdrawn," Crawford said smoothly. But his point was made. The final witness of the day was unexpected. The defense calls Annabeth Holt. Annie felt Thatcher's hand tighten on hers. They hadn't discussed her testifying, but Crawford nodded encouragingly, and she found herself walking to the witness stand on unsteady legs. "State your name for the record." "Annabeth Carter Holt." Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "Mrs. Holt, tell the court how you came to marry the defendant." Annie took a breath, knowing this was her chance to speak truth in the face of all the lies and insinuations. "I was sent west as a mail-order bride. Nobody wanted me because I was considered too tall, too plain, too unwomanly." She met Clara's eyes directly. "I was sold for $20 to a broker who treated me and the other women like livestock." The courtroom was silent now, hanging on her words. "Thatcher, Mr. Holt, he took me in when no one else would. Not out of desperation or loneliness, as has been suggested, but out of basic human decency. He gave me work, a home, respect. He defended me against men who tried to treat me as property, and eventually," her voice softened, "he gave me love." "Mrs. Holt." Pemberton rose for cross-examination, his tone patronizing. "Isn't it true that you have no education, no family connections, no understanding of how to run a proper household?" "That depends on what you mean by proper." Annie replied steadily. "I can't do needlepoint or play piano, but I can ride, rope, shoot, and keep accurate account books. I can birth a calf, mend a fence, and stretch a dollar until it screams. I've increased the ranch's productivity by 30% since I arrived." "But surely a woman in your condition," his eyes dropped meaningfully to her belly, "should be focused on gentler pursuits?" "My condition," Annie said firmly, "doesn't change who I am. I'll teach my child, son or daughter, to work hard, stand tall, and face whatever comes with courage. That's the legacy I can offer. Not water rights or family money, but strength and love and the knowledge that they're valued for who they are, not who others think they should be." "No further questions." Pemberton said dismissively. As Annie returned to her seat, she caught sight of an unexpected face in the back of the courtroom. A weathered ranch hand she recognized but couldn't quite place. He nodded at her respectfully, then slipped out the door. Judge Thornton called a recess until the next morning for final arguments. As they filed out of the courtroom, Annie overheard snatches of conversation from the townspeople. She held her own up there. Still a woman like that, running a ranch. Did you see her hands? Like a field worker's. Outside, Thatcher pulled her into the alley beside the courthouse, away from curious eyes. You were magnificent, he said fiercely, cupping her face in his hands. Absolutely magnificent. I was terrified, she admitted, leaning into his strength. It didn't show. He pressed his forehead to hers. Whatever happens tomorrow, Annie, I want you to know— Pardon me, Mr. Holt. They turned to find the weathered ranch hand from the courtroom. Up close, Annie recognized him. Ben Hartley, who worked for a spread 15 miles south. Ben? Thatcher acknowledged. What brings you to town? The trial, sir. Had to come when I heard what they were saying about your missus. He turned to Annie, hat in hand. Ma'am, you probably don't remember, but last spring, during the floods, you helped pull my nephew out of Willow Creek. Boy was trying to save a calf and got swept downstream. You rode in without thinking twice, grabbed him up, saved his life. Annie did remember. A terrified boy clinging to a half-drowned calf, the current trying to drag them both under. You were wearing men's clothes, Ben continued. Riding astride like a proper hand, my sister-in-law pitched a fit about propriety and such. But I told her, I don't care if you were wearing feathers and riding backwards. You saved that boy. That makes you a lady in my book, and anyone who says different can answer to me. He nodded decisively and walked away before either of them could respond. How many lives have you touched that I don't even know about? Thatcher asked wonderingly. Annie didn't answer, too moved by the unexpected support. They walked slowly back to the boarding house where they were staying, Annie's back protesting every step. That night, as they lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the sounds of town life outside their window, Annie felt the baby kick strongly. Active tonight, Thatcher observed, his hand spread over her belly. Maybe they know something important is happening, Annie said, fighting for their future before they're even born. Our little fighter, Thatcher murmured. Taking after their mother already. Or their father. Annie countered. You're the one who stood up to Crowley, who's fighting the Whitfields now. We're both fighters, he said. Maybe that's why we found each other. Two stubborn souls who refuse to be told what we're worth. The next morning dawned clear and cold. The courtroom was even more packed than the day before, word having spread about Annie's testimony. As closing arguments began, she spotted several faces she recognized, ranch wives who'd bought eggs from her, cowboys who'd traded horses with Thatcher, even the minister's wife who'd always been coolly polite. Pemberton went first, painting a picture of poor Martha, betrayed in death by a husband who'd moved on too quickly with an unsuitable woman. He lingered on every insinuation about Annie's background, her appearance, her rough ways. Then Crawford rose. He was younger, less polished than his opponent, but his words carried conviction. Your Honor, gentlemen of the jury, we've heard a lot about what makes a suitable wife, a proper lady, a rightful heir. We've heard that Annie Holt is too tall, too strong, too different. But I ask you, different from what? From a standard that says women should be decorative rather than useful, weak rather than capable, silent rather than strong? He gestured toward Annie. This woman saved a ranch that was failing. She saved a child from drowning. She saved a man from drowning in his own grief. If that's unsuitable, then perhaps we need to reconsider our definitions. He paused, letting his words sink in. The law is clear. Martha Holt left her possessions to her husband. There was no valid trust, no conditions on inheritance. The Whitfields seek to use this court to punish a man for the crime of finding love again, and a woman for the crime of being different. Don't let them— Judge Thornton sent the jury to deliberate. The hours crawled by. Annie dozed fitfully on Thatcher's shoulder, the baby restless within her. Finally. The bailiff called them back. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor. In the matter of Whitfield versus Holt, we find in favor of the defendant. The water rights remain with the Holt Ranch." The courtroom erupted. Clara let out a cry of outrage. Whitfield's face went purple, but Annie heard none of it, lost in the rush of relief that made her knees weak. "Furthermore," Judge Thornton said, raising his voice over the noise, "I want to add something for the record. In my 20 years on this bench, I've seen all manner of people come before me. Character isn't measured in inches or social graces. It's measured in actions, in courage, in the capacity to love and be loved. Mrs. Holt, you've shown more character in this courtroom than many who consider themselves your betters. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." As they left the courthouse, the February sun bright on the snow, Annie felt lighter than she had in months. The ranch was safe. Their child would have a birthright. And she'd stood tall in front of the whole town and claimed her place. "Home?" Thatcher asked, helping her into the wagon. "Home," she agreed, then gasped as the baby delivered a particularly forceful kick. "I think someone else is ready to get back to the ranch too." Thatcher laughed, the sound free and joyful in the crisp air. "Then let's go home, Mrs. Holt, all three of us." As they drove out of Silver Creek, Annie looked back once at the town that had witnessed her judgment and vindication. Then she faced forward, toward the mountains and the ranch and the future they'd fought to protect. Her hand found Thatcher's on the reins, and together they headed home. Spring arrived with the subtlety of a freight train, transforming the desert from winter browns to a riot of color seemingly overnight. Purple lupines carpeted the hillsides, golden poppies swayed in the warm breeze, and the cottonwoods along Willow Creek burst into tender green. Annie stood in what would be their vegetable garden, hands pressed to her lower back, watching Thatcher and Jake work on expanding the fence. At 8 months pregnant, every movement had become an effort. The child she carried seemed determined to rearrange her insides, delivering kicks and punches that sometimes took her breath away, but she wouldn't complain. This baby was a fighter, just like its parents. "Annie, you should be resting," Mary called from the porch where she was hanging laundry. Jake's wife had taken to coming by daily as Annie's time drew near, bringing food, advice, and welcome company. "I'm just planning," Annie replied, though she gratefully accepted the chair Mary brought out for her. "The soil's good here. We could have corn, beans, squash, maybe some melons if we can keep the rabbits out." Mary settled beside her with her mending. "Your nesting always happens near the end. I once scrubbed every inch of floor in our soddy the day before my third came." Annie smiled, running her hand over her belly as the baby shifted. "I want everything ready. Perfect. The house, the garden." She paused. "Do you think I'm foolish? Trying to grow vegetables in the desert? Honey, you've grown a thriving ranch and a baby in this desert. Vegetables should be easy compared to that." They worked in companionable silence for a while, Annie sketching garden plans while Mary's needle flashed in the sun. The peace was broken by the sound of approaching horses, not the familiar gait of neighbors, but something that made both women look up warily. 3 riders appeared on the ridge, and Annie's heart sank as she recognized the lead figure, Josiah Crowley, the trader who'd brought her west and tried to reclaim her months ago. His face was thinner, meaner, and he rode with 2 rough-looking companions. Thatcher and Jake had spotted them too, abandoning their work to walk toward the house. Thatcher's hand rested casual-like on his pistol, but Annie could see the tension in his shoulders. "That's far enough, Crowley," Thatcher called when the riders were still 20 yards out. "State your business from there." Crowley's smile was all malice. "Now, is that any way to greet an old friend? I've come to congratulate you on your court victory, and to see how my merchandise is faring." "Your merchandise?" Thatcher's voice dropped dangerously low. "The woman. Heard she's breeding now. That'll increase her value considerably. Some men pay extra for proven breeders." Annie stood despite Mary's restraining hand, fury overcoming caution. "Get off our land!" Crowley's eyes raked over her swollen form with a leer that made her skin crawl. My, filled out nice, haven't you? Though I reckon you're about as graceful as a pregnant cow." What happened next occurred so fast Annie barely processed it. Thatcher moved like lightning, dragging Crowley from his saddle and driving a fist into his jaw. The traitor hit the ground hard, and Thatcher followed him down, landing another blow before Jake pulled him back. "Touch him again and we shoot," one of Crowley's companions warned, hand on his gun. "Try it," Jake replied evenly, his own weapon already drawn. Crowley staggered to his feet, blood streaming from his nose. "You'll pay for that. Holt, both of you will pay. That woman owes me money, and I aim to collect one way or another. The only thing you'll collect is a bullet if you come here again." Thatcher growled. "Now get out before I finish what I started." Crowley spat blood into the dust. "This isn't over. You can't protect her forever. Holt, sooner or later, you'll slip up, and I'll be waiting." They watched the three men ride away, tension hanging thick in the air until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did Thatcher turn to Annie, his face a mix of anger and concern. "Did he hurt you, the baby?" "We're fine," Annie assured him, though her hands trembled slightly. "Just angry. I should have killed him the first time," Thatcher muttered. "Should have? No." Annie caught his face between her hands. "No more violence, not unless we have no choice. I won't have our child born into blood and vengeance." He pulled her against him, mindful of her belly between them. "I'm sorry. When he looked at you like that, talked about you like you were still property to be traded." He shuddered. "I saw red. I know." She stroked his hair, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against her chest. "But he's gone now. We won, remember? The trial, the water rights, everything. He's just a bitter man trying to scare us." But that night, Thatcher posted guards, and Annie noticed he kept his rifle closer than usual. 2 weeks later, Annie woke to a wetness that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn dew. For a moment, she lay still, processing what was happening. Then a cramp rolled through her belly, low and insistent, and she knew. "Thatcher," she shook his shoulder gently. "Thatcher, wake up, it's time." He came awake instantly, a skill learned from years of range work. Time for—" His eyes widened. "The baby." "The baby," she confirmed, then gasped as another pain hit. What followed was a blur of activity. Thatcher sent Jake racing for Doc Morrison and Mary while he helped Annie into a clean nightgown and prepared the bedroom as she'd instructed weeks ago. Annie tried to stay calm, but the pains were coming faster than she'd expected, each one stealing her breath. "Doc Morrison said first babies take their time," she panted between contractions. "This one didn't get that message." Mary arrived first, taking charge with the efficiency of experience. "Men out," she ordered, shooing both Thatcher and Jake from the room. "This is women's work now." "I'm not leaving her," Thatcher protested. "You'll do as you're told," Mary said firmly. "Unless you want to be in the way when things get messy." But Annie caught his hand. "Stay, please, I need you here." Mary looked scandalized. "It ain't proper. Nothing about us has been proper," Annie managed before another pain hit. "Why start now?" So Thatcher stayed, holding her hand through the waves of pain, wiping sweat from her brow, murmuring encouragement when she thought she couldn't bear another moment. Doc Morrison arrived as the sun was rising, taking in the scene with raised eyebrows but no comment. "Well, Mrs. Holt, seems this little one is in a hurry," he said after examining her. "You're nearly there already. When the next pain comes, you push." What followed was the hardest thing Annie had ever done. She'd faced down storms and stampedes, prejudice and poverty. But bringing new life into the world demanded every ounce of strength she possessed. Through it all, Thatcher never left her side, never flinched no matter how hard she squeezed his hand. Then, as the morning sun painted the mountains gold, their child entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to every eye in the room. "It's a girl," Doc Morrison announced, cleaning the baby and wrapping her in soft flannel. "A perfect, healthy girl." He placed the baby in Annie's arms. and the world stopped. She was small but not fragile, with a cap of dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. When she wrapped one tiny fist around Annie's finger, Annie felt her heart expand beyond anything she'd thought possible. "She's beautiful," Thatcher whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "God, Annie, she's perfect." "What will you call her?" Mary asked, beaming at the little family. Annie looked at Thatcher, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. "Hope," she said softly. "Hope, Martha Holt." The baby, Hope, yawned widely, then settled against her mother's breast with a contented sigh. In that moment, the dangerous world outside their walls didn't matter. Crowley's threats, society's judgments, the harsh realities of frontier life, all of it faded before the miracle of new life. Over the following days, the ranch became a place of pilgrimage as neighbors came to meet the newest Holt. Even some who'd been cool toward Annie before seemed softened by the sight of her cradling her daughter. This tall woman made gentle by motherhood. "She's got your eyes," Jake's wife observed. "But that determined chin is all Thatcher." Annie laughed, adjusting Hope's blanket as the baby nursed. "Heaven help us when she's older. Then 2 stubborn parents will make for one headstrong child. But she wouldn't have it any other way. Her daughter would grow up strong and free, unbound by the limitations that had constrained Annie's youth. She'd learn to ride and rope alongside any brothers that might come, would stand tall without shame, would know her worth wasn't measured by her appearance, but by her character." One evening, when Hope was a week old, Annie carried her out to the porch to watch the sunset. Thatcher joined them, wrapping his arms around both his girls, and they stood together watching the sky turn to fire over the mountains. "Penny for your thoughts," he murmured. Annie smiled, pressing a kiss to Hope's downy head. "I was thinking about journeys. How mine started with being sold for almost nothing, unwanted and afraid, and look where it led." She gestured at the ranch spread before them, their land, their home, their life. "All of this, her, worth more than gold. You were never worth just $20, Thatcher said fiercely. "That was just what small minds could see. Your real worth." He paused, searching for words. "It's in how you never gave up, how you made this place bloom, how you made me believe in tomorrow again when all I could see was yesterday." Hope stirred in her sleep, making small sounds that never failed to enchant her besotted parents. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "What do you think she'll be?" Annie wondered aloud. "Our Hope. Whatever she wants." Thatcher replied without hesitation. "And we'll make sure the world lets her." They stayed on the porch until full dark, their daughter safe between them, planning gardens and futures and dreams. Inside the house, a cradle Thatcher had carved himself waited by their bed. The vegetable plot Annie had planned was ready for planting. The ranch was thriving. The cattle fat on spring grass, the water of Willow Creek flowing clear and free. It hadn't been an easy journey. There'd been storms and threats, tears and trials. There would be more challenges ahead. Crowley might return. Droughts would come. Hope would face her own struggles as a tall woman's daughter in a world that valued delicacy. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, there was just this, a family forged from loneliness and hope, standing together on land they'd fought to keep, under stars that blessed all dreams equally. Annie thought of the girl she'd been, climbing into that wagon in Missouri. Sure, she was heading toward a life of servitude and sorrow. If she could tell that girl what waited for her, love, land, a daughter, a life of her own making, would she have believed it? Hope made a small sound, and Annie adjusted her hold, swaying gently. "Shh, little one, Mama's here, Papa's here, you're home." And they were. All of them, finally, were home. The desert wind sang through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. But here, in the circle of Thatcher's arms, with Hope sleeping peacefully against her heart, Annie had found something worth more than all the gold in California, all the water rights in New Mexico, all the proper opinions in the world. She'd found her place, and it was exactly where she belonged. Thank you for listening to this story. Dear audience, I hope you enjoyed following Annie and Thatcher's journey from strangers to soulmates in the Wild West. Where are you listening from today? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to connect with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Annie's transformation. What part of their story touched your heart the most?